Hi, I'm going to be talking today about glacial dynamics. We need to understand how glacial ice behaves before we can understand the processes involved in glaciers. Glaciers are powerful agents of erosion and deposition, and they've given rise to some of the most spectacular scenery in the world, in alpine areas in particular. We'll start with a consideration of glaciers as a feature. They're masses of ice that are moving at present or have moved in the past. Glacial flow begins when the ice reaches a thickness of about 100 feet. The actual thickness that's critical is dependent partly on the temperature of the ice and the surface slope. Modern day glaciers are found in the high latitudes. Particularly Greenland is covered with a huge dome of ice, so is Antarctica, and then they're scattered at high elevations across the rest of the world, in the Andes and the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas in the U.S., in the Alps in Europe, the Caucasus Range, and the Himalayas. So they're a wide distribution, both at high latitudes and at high elevations. Now, glaciers form when there's more snow that falls in the winter than melts in the summer. Usually winters are snowy enough. It's the problem to getting the snow to last through the summer. And that can happen if we have an unusually cool summer. It happened a lot during the so-called Ice Age, or the Pleistocene, when summers were quite cool in the northern hemisphere, mainly because the tilt of the Earth's axis was less then than it is today, so summers were cooler. In any case, when the snow accumulates over the summer, it gradually gets converted from a frilly snowflake to a little mass of snow called firn, and then through melting and refreezing and compaction, those layers of firn are converted into glacial ice, and as the glacial ice density increases, it often takes on a bluish color. Now, glaciers gain snow and ice. We call that process accumulation by direct snowfall. It's not that important because that would be just snow falling directly on the ice. And then wind-drifted snow, snow that comes in from the upwind source areas, like a big plateau where snow falls and is blowing onto the ice. Some glaciers that sit below mountain peaks and valley sides gain a lot of snow and ice from avalanching from above. So those are the mechanisms of accumulation. The upper part of the glacier, where we have more snow and ice accumulating over the year than is lost, and we call that process ablation. That upper zone is called the zone of accumulation. In the summer, the zone of accumulation is covered with snow and ice. Here's a nice cross-section of a glacier. If you look at the top of the glacier, you see a white zone. That is the zone of accumulation, where more snow and ice have accumulated over the winter than is melted during the summer. The lower part of the glacier, where we see the blue color only, that's an area of net loss. And so we have two distinct zones on the glacier. An upper zone where there's more accumulation of snow and ice over the course of the year, and a lower zone where there's a net loss. And we call that the losing of ice and snow ablation. Those two parts of the glacier are separated by the firn line in mid or late summer, when the melting is pretty much, or ablation is pretty much completed. This is the accumulation zone of a glacier in Jasper National Park in Canada, where the snow-covered surface you see in the foreground, beneath that is glacial ice, and then in the middle ground you'll see some darker ice. That's where crevassing is taking place as the glacier flows down a steeper slope, kind of pulls apart from the slower moving ice above, and that shows up quite distinctly. It's safe to drive and walk on the flatter lower part, but you got to be careful about the upper part where the crevasses are present. Here's a very nice slide of the smallest active glacier in the U.S. It's called the Palisade Glacier. It's in the Sierra Nevadas of California. You can see quite clearly an upper zone where it's all white, and then a lower zone that's dark and gray and kind of streaked. Well, the upper zone, that's whitish, is called the zone of accumulation. That's where more snow and ice are accumulating over the course of the year than is being lost. The lower part, which is the bigger part of the glacier that we're looking at, that's called the zone of ablation. And that boundary between the two, kind of an irregular boundary between the gray or dirty ice, that's called the firn line. Ablation is the opposite of accumulation. This is how glaciers lose snow and ice. And the most obvious way is through melting, and this occurs during the summer months in particular. We also, glaciers can experience sublimation. We go from ice directly to vapor. This happens when temperatures are below freezing all the time, and it takes an enormous amount of energy for sublimation to take place. This occurs in the high latitudes glaciers like Antarctica and Greenland. If you've ever witnessed ice cubes in your freezer get smaller over time, even though there's no melting taking place, that's sublimation. The third process of ablation is calving. This is the most spectacular form of ablation, where big chunks of ice fall off the glacier, often with a very noisy process and a lot of oohs and ahs for people that witness it, and a big wave is generated as the block of ice falls in the water, and ice is lost in that fashion. Only glaciers that terminate in the ocean lose ice in that fashion. The lower part of the glacier, where ablation exceeds accumulation over the course of the year, is called the zone of ablation. So two distinct zones: an upper zone of accumulation, the lower zone of ablation. In the summer, the zone of ablation is partly covered with rock debris, doesn't look much like a glacier. These are my grandsons. They're standing at the snout of a glacier in Norway, and you can see there's tunnels in the ice, and coming out of those tunnels is meltwater. It's a very significant process of ablation. Here we see a meltwater stream leaving the exit glacier in Alaska, and the rocky debris on either side has been deposited by large volumes of meltwater escaping from the glacier. Another example of escaping meltwater coming from a glacier is shown here in an area in Norway. Now we're going to look at a very high cliff face developed in the Tidewater Glacier that we call the Hubbard Glacier. It's in Alaska, in Yakutat Bay. And if you've been on an Alaskan cruise, very often they'll go to Yakutat Bay, and you can actually get quite close to the Hubbard Glacier. It's a massive tidewater glacier that has flowed into Yakutat Bay. It is grounded, so the ice is sitting on the bottom of the bay. We see about, maybe 200 feet of ice here that's exposed above the water line. There's another 400 feet of ice below the water line resting on the bottom. You see that little red boat sailing up to the glacier. Those are about 6 or 7 people in a rubber raft. If you look at the ice wall in the background, you can see places where ice has fallen off. That's how icebergs form in the calving process, where chunks of ice simply fall off into the water. And here's an example of how that might have very spectacular sound and noise, and a big wave is generated as this block of ice falls in the ocean in the process that's referred to as calving. So tidewater glaciers that empty in the ocean can suffer quite a bit of ablation through the calving process. It's a very spectacular process, and by far the most spectacular of the ablation processes. This is in Patagonia, and our guide here is standing on a rock surface, and there's a block of ice at his feet, and that particular block of ice was put there by a berg wave. In the background, you can see across the water an active glacier that is dumping icebergs into the water. The calving process is ongoing, and then as those blocks of ice fall in the water in the calving process, they generate a berg wave that washes right up on the shore. So that block at his feet could only get there through a berg wave washing up that rock surface. So you got to be careful when you kayak around the snout of a glacier because of calving, the berg waves that are generated, and then on occasion is even submarine calving where a block of ice kind of pops up from the bottom of the glacier. Now, glaciers have budgets like we have budgets, gains and losses. Glaciers that experience a lot of accumulation and a lot of ablation have what we call active budgets, a lot of gain, a lot of loss, and they tend to flow rapidly. That's because when glaciers that have a lot of accumulation get thicker in the zone of accumulation, while they're getting thinner in the zone of ablation. So the surface slope steepens, and the steeper the slope of the ice is, the faster it flows. We find glaciers with active budgets in the lower latitudes where it's warmer. There's a lot of snow in the winter, but also a lot of ice loss during the summer. The flip side of that are glaciers with passive budgets. We find these in Antarctica and Greenland, where it's very cold, so there's very little snow accumulation during the winter, and at the same time very little ablation in the summertime, and so there is less of a slope because we're not adding much ice, nor are we losing much ice, and a gentle slope develops, and they tend to flow slowly. Those are glaciers with passive budgets, and they're found mainly in the high latitudes. Another way we can classify glaciers, in addition to their budget, is their form or their shape. Some are unconfined and have a dome-like form, kind of a convex cross-section. We call these ice sheets or ice caps. Greenland and Antarctica have huge ice caps or ice sheets developed on those islands and continents. In North America, there's a huge massive ice called the Laurentide ice sheet that we think was about 10,000 feet thick, reaching its maximum height over Hudson Bay, and it flowed both south from that central high point into the United States, getting as far south as the Ohio River and as far west as the Missouri River during the Ice Age. It also flowed north into Canada from that central high place. Glaciers that are confined by rock include cirque glaciers. These are circular glaciers found in basins called cirques in alpine areas. And typically, as a cirque glacier grows, it flows out over its basin and down into a pre-existing stream valley, and the ice then modifies that stream valley, and the glacier in the valley is called a valley glacier. These are found in alpine areas. This is a small ice cap glacier in Norway. The ice is flowing out from a central high place in all directions. Here's another example of a ice cap glacier in Norway. See patches of snow, and then on top in the zone of accumulation, and then the bluer ice exposed at the bottom is the zone of ablation. This is a small cirque glacier in the Sierra Nevadas of California. It's surrounded by rock walls on three sides, and you can see patches of gray ice poking out beneath the snow that's slid down. And then Palisade Glacier, once again, this is the smallest, or the southernmost active glacier in the United States. It occupies a cirque in the Sierra Nevadas. It has a very small area of accumulation. That's that white area at the top of the glacier. And then most of it is in the zone of ablation. That's the lower part. And it occupies a cirque glacier up above Big Pine, California. This is a valley glacier, and it's ice that's flowing down a valley, kind of like a stream. There's a lot of similarities in terms of having tributaries like a stream does. The big difference, obviously, is that the ice flows a lot slower than the water, and it actually flows in what we call a laminar fashion. There was sheets of ice are gliding past each other. There's no turbulence in a valley glacier like there is in a stream in a valley. It's another rather famous valley glacier. It's called the Great Aletsch Glacier. It's the longest glacier in the Alps. It's about 7 miles long. It has retreated dramatically in the last decade or so, and you can see some dark stripes running down its length. Those are medial moraines, and we'll talk about those a little later on. Here's another narrow valley glacier in Torres del Paine National Park in Chile. You see the blue ice kind of exposed there in the central section. And then if you follow, your eye goes up the glacier, you can see where it comes from higher elevations and flows down a steep slope in the course of getting to where we see it in the center of the slide. And in the middle of the slide, we see a valley glacier surrounded by peaks on valley sidewalls on all sides. Again, we're in Torres del Paine National Park in Patagonia in Chile. So this spectacular landscape you see of sheer rock walls and pointy peaks called horns are all associated with glaciation by alpine glaciers, some of which are valley glaciers and some of which are cirque glaciers. This is the snout of the Glacial Glacier in Norway. You can see some people kind of climbing up on the right-hand side for scale. It has flowed off the top of a plateau, because on that plateau there's a ice cap glacier, and radiating out from that ice cap glacier are arms of ice that flow down valleys, and this happens to be probably the most accessible of those arms, and it's got a name. It's called the Glacial Glacier. And you can see as you look up the glacier, a zone of crevassing as the glacier flows down a steep slope and starts developing tensional stresses that pulls away from the slower moving ice higher up. Another example of a valley glacier descending a steep slope and starting to crevasse is the Eiger Glacier in the Swiss Alps. Now, glaciers, in addition to their form and budget, can be classified according to their temperature. Warm glaciers have temperatures close to freezing and so experience pressure melting, and they have meltwater at their base. This happens in areas with higher temperatures at lower latitudes, and the ice is at equilibrium with the temperature and the ice pressure in equilibrium. And if the pressure is increased when a glacier goes over a rock mass, we get melting. And that melting accumulates at the bottom of the glacier and allows it to flow rapidly, kind of riding over a film of water. If you watch people skate on an ice rink, they're skating on ice that's at the pressure melting point, and their body weight causes the ice the additional pressure of their body weight causes the ice to melt, and they glide across the ice surface on a thin layer of meltwater that freezes as they skate along behind them. They have active budgets, these warm glaciers. A lot of gains, a lot of losses. Cold glaciers are so cold, they're too cold for pressure melting, and they're basically frozen to their beds. They flow very slowly, in part because the ice is very viscous and it resists deformation at low temperatures, and these glaciers tend to have passive budgets. So the cold ice and the passive budget almost guarantees a very slow rate of flow. Warm glaciers, they're less viscous, and they have active budgets and a steep slope, and that accelerates their rate of flow. The flow itself, very slow. 3 feet a day is typical. It's laminar, as I mentioned. There's sheets of ice are sliding along. They're not mixing with each other. All glaciers flow by plastic deformation, and this occurs when the ice is about 100 feet thick or so, and that thick ice eventually causes the lower layers of ice to begin deforming in response to that shear stress, and the deformation is plastic. I mean, it's a permanent deformation as the ice flows under the influence of gravity downslope from the zone of accumulation to the zone of ablation. So the ice is always flowing under the influence of gravity from the zone of accumulation, where the ice is thicker, to where the ice is thinner in the zone of ablation. The upper 100 feet or so is called brittle ice, and it's basically too thin to flow. So it's being kind of dragged along by the lower part of the glacier. We call that the zone of flow, where that overlying ice produces enough of a shear stress for the flow to begin in the basal layers. So the basal layers in the zone of flow are deforming, the color, and they're under great pressure, and so the color of the ice tends to be blue. In warm glaciers, they also flow by basal slip. That meltwater layer allows the glacier to slip forward en masse. If there's a lot of meltwater beneath the ice, it can actually kind of hydroplane, scoot down the mountain. We call those surging glaciers. Another way that flow is accomplished, again, very slow, where you up ice melting and then down ice refreezing, allows ice to be transferred from the upper part of the glacier to the lower part. Glaciers always flow from the zone of accumulation to the zone of ablation. The snout of the glacier may retreat if the arriving ice isn't keeping up with the ablation at the snout. If there is a lot of ice flowing down, the snout will advance. So the snout can go back or forth depending upon how much ice is arriving and how much is melting. but keep in mind that the ice is always flowing downslope, and because we're moving ice from the upper part where it's accumulating to the lower part where we're losing it. Glaciers can get so thin, i.e. at less than 100 feet, so they don't have a zone of flow anymore. They stop flowing, they become stagnant, and they simply melt down in place. This is along an ice wall in a tunnel drilled into the Great Aletsch Glacier in Switzerland. And you can see different layers of ice. These were inherited from the snow, and it was laid down in kind of horizontal, subhorizontal sheets. You see a light, probably ice that survived the winter. And then there's kind of a layer in the middle that has some rock fragments in it, is lighter colored. That layer is formed by the refreezing of meltwater. So during the summer, even in the zone of accumulation, we get some melting, and then debris falls on the ice, and then during the winter that refreezes. So we're looking at that kind of stony layer of whiter ice that represents, call it a regulation layer, a layer of ice that's formed by refreezing of meltwater. In any case, the ice is layered typically, but those layers get deformed because the ice is flowing. Here's a really good example of a glacier cross-section. This is the Hubbard Glacier in Alaska. You can see the upper part of the glacier where it's crevassed and it's kind of white in color. That's the brittle ice, and that's creating a load on the lowermost part of the glacier, which is deforming plastically. And we can see that zone of flow exposed there at the bottom as those dark blue lines where the crevasses end. So we have in this slide both the lower zone of flow and the brittle zone nicely exposed. Here's an example of a flow structure preserved in a glacier in Glacier Bay National Park. So obviously in the past this particular part of the glacier was in the zone of flow and it deformed plastically, and this is the consequence of that plastic deformation, that big fold that you see kind of turned over. This is it looks like a stagnant glacier. You don't see any ice. When they get so thin, they stop flowing. They need again a critical thickness, and as the ice begins to melt away, the debris in the glacier becomes more and more prominent until that's all you see is the debris. This glacier, that last one was in Alaska. This one is in Patagonia, and it too looks like it's stagnant. It's covered with debris. It's quite thin. So this is typical of glaciers. At the very snouts, the ice gets so thin they're no longer thick enough to move. And but as you go up glacier, the ice thickens and is once again moving. What can happen sometimes is this dead ice or stagnant ice at the bottom at the snout can be overridden by still flowing ice from higher up in the glacier. Now, on the surface of glaciers, you see things like crevasses and seracs and lateral and medial moraines. The crevasses are just these cracks that form in the brittle ice. One way they can form is when the ice accelerates and a faster moving ice pulls away from slower moving ice, and these cracks develop and they extend down maybe 100 feet to the bottom of the brittle zone. When glaciers flow out of a valley into a level area, they spread out, and that produces tension, and that produces crevasses in the brittle zone. And these network of crevasses can intersect, and we have blocks of ice that are separated by crevasses that are called seracs. Valley glaciers and cirque glaciers have debris that is deposited on top by landsliding on top of the ice. Lateral moraines are just ridges of debris that parallel the glacier on both sides, and they're carried along by the ice. When two valley glaciers meet, their adjacent lateral moraines merge to form a single medial moraine down the center of the main glacier. So we have a lot of debris on top of the glacier that's somewhat organized into ridges that parallel the direction of ice flow. Those are the lateral and medial moraines. Here's a network of crevasses cutting across the Hubbard Glacier. You can see the crevasses have cut across two dark zones. Those are medial moraines that have been disturbed by the crevassing process. And here is a glacier in Patagonia, and those isolated peaks they're actually small masses of ice. Those are seracs. They're formed by the masses of ice that develop in between intersecting crevasses, and they can then tumble into the water in the calving process. It's a very irregular surface. Here's a close-up of some seracs. You see some dirty ice exposed and some blue ice, so indicating the banded nature of ice. And these seracs in this glacier, in Glacier National Park, then can tumble into the water during the calving process. Here's a spectacular glacier in Glacier Bay, or sorry, in Yakutat Bay. This is Turner Glacier, and it is flowing into Yakutat Bay. It's near the Hubbard Glacier, which is actually off to our right. And we see, maybe 6 or 7 medial moraines running down the length of the Turner Glacier. And you notice how steep the snout of the glacier is. It's because blocks of ice are falling off into the water, creating icebergs. And that process is stimulated by the warm water conducting heat in the ice, and at the bottom of the glacier where it meets the water, and at the same time as ice is flowing forward, so it kind of gets over steep, and these blocks tumble off to form icebergs. Here's 2 valley glaciers in Greenland. They're about to meet. There's a kind of a dirty line between the two. That's the medial moraine, and then it's fed by lateral moraines coming from each glacier. And around the snout of the main glacier, you see a lot of dark gray. Those are lateral. And then the terminus is called the terminal moraine. So this is debris then that is transported on top of the ice by the glacier. That's eventually let down or deposited and becomes a landform. Out in front of the glaciers is kind of a gray area. This is all material deposited by meltwater escaping from the ice margin. People use glaciers, they form spectacular scenery. People ski on them in the Alps. You also use them for hydropower, the meltwater, and also is used for irrigation, domestic consumption, and for a long time before refrigeration got automated, ice was imported from places like Norway for purposes of refrigeration. And in the Victorian era, ice was shipped actually across the Atlantic to serve Queen Victoria. So there was a lot of demand for ice prior to the development of refrigeration. Here's a bottle of, it's called Olden Olden water. It's actually glacial water. It comes from the glacier in the background. So what they've done is purify the glacial meltwater and bottle it, and been trying to market it as something kind of special. And we also, there's been a tradition of people in areas with glaciers, when they're done hiking, they deserve a drink like scotch on the rocks, and the rocks are glacial ice, and that's what's going on here at the snout of a glacier in Patagonia. We're getting a reward for hiking about 20 feet up a glacier. Anyway, so that's kind of a quick overview of glacial dynamics and surface features, and hopefully this will help you better understand glacial processes like erosion and deposition, and then that leads to an understanding of the landforms they produce. Thanks for your attention.